Pope Francis, who led the Catholic Church for the last 12 years, died on Monday morning. The Vatican confirmed that he died of a cerebral stroke and cardiocirculatory collapse. The Pope's death came less than a month after he was released from the hospital after a battle with double pneumonia. He was 88.
I think Pope Francis will be remembered as a very different kind of pope. He was a pope who really did not stand on ceremony, and as the first Jesuit and the first Latin American pope, brought a very different view to the Holy See than we have seen before.
Anthony Faiola is the Rome bureau chief for the Post and has covered Pope Francis for more than a decade. He says the issues Pope Francis championed, from combating climate change to welcoming migrants to expanding acceptance of same-sex couples, meant that he was often seen as a liberal. But his ideology is not so easily defined.
It's too easy to call him a liberal pope. You can't really sort of view Catholic pontiffs as sort of liberal or conservative, quite in the same terms that you would politicians. But certainly during his 12-year pontificate, he had been more embraced by liberals than he was by ultra-conservatives, even though those liberals would often be frustrated with his pace of change.
The Pope's inclusive approach often provoked criticism from more conservative corners of the Church. Now, in the wake of his death, there are a lot of questions about who the new Pope will be and how he might lead the Catholic Church.
Within 15 days to 20 days, there will be a new conclave. The princes of the church, the cardinals, who will gather together in the Sistine Chapel and elect the next pope. This will be the largest conclave in the history of the church. It will also be the most diverse, with cardinals coming from parts of the globe that never before had representation in a conclave. It means that there's a big wild card now. Even the most astute Vatican watchers would not hazard a guess as to who the next pope will be.
From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Colby Ickowitz. It's Monday, April 21st. Today, how Pope Francis reshaped the papacy and whether those changes will outlive him. Anthony, hi. Thank you so much for joining us on what I know is an incredibly busy and somber day.
Thank you for having me, and it is indeed a sad day.
Anthony, you live in Rome. You've covered the Vatican off and on for about a decade. Can you start by telling me how you're feeling by the news?
Well, it's a jarring moment. I think we all saw this coming in some extent after the Pope's 5-week battle with double pneumonia. Even after he was discharged, I think there was a sentiment among Vatican correspondents that the Holy Father was probably living on borrowed time. That said, as much as this was a death foretold, I think it also came as a surprise. There were Vatican officials today that were deeply moved and in some ways deeply surprised that the end had come so shortly after Pope Francis had made a public appearance in St. Peter's Square, where he had greeted 35,000 faithful by going through the crowds in a Pope-mobile. He blessed a baby from that Pope-mobile. And even before that, he held a meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance at the Vatican, who was visiting. Those will be remembered as a very busy last 24 hours of the Pope, who had actually been told by his doctors to rest and to avoid large crowds. But this was a man who always put his duty first and who made it clear that he was not going to be seen as a sequestered pope who was isolated from his flock. And I think, what we saw in those last 24 hours was an embodiment of who he was as pope.
Yeah, he had this massive job of leading nearly, 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. You talk about how he kind of changed the tone. Talk about the other ways or kind of how he changed the scope of the church in his time as Pope.
Sure. He did do a number of different things that were very real. He sort of solidified Catholic teachings against the death penalty, for one, which was one of the concrete things that he did. But he also embraced more pastoral measures that changed the way in which many priests around the globe were able to do their jobs. One of the biggest changes was relatively recent when he authorized priests to bless some same-sex couples. This caused a massive consternation within the church, with many of the dioceses in Africa, for instance, in Central Asia, pushing back on that. And some people would say that Francis was at times confusing in his teachings, that, he would say one thing and do another. But I think often what you could say about the Pope was that if he kept any line of thought that was straight in his papacy, it was always the open door. That's what he will be remembered for most, for making sure that anyone who wanted to be a member of the Catholic Church would be welcomed by the Catholic Church.
Anthony, let's go back briefly to 2013, which is when Pope Francis became the Pope. Why was Pope Francis such an exciting choice to lead the church at the time? What was the papacy like before him?
So, at the time that Francis was named Pope, you could argue that it was a church in crisis. Pope Benedict had become the first pontiff in nearly 600 years to retire, and this happened amid scandals that were swirling around the Vatican.
The bombshell announcement affects more than 1 billion Roman Catholics around the world.
His retirement this week is being clouded by scandal as
there were Vati leaks that were bringing forward all sorts of dirty laundry that was inside of the Vatican about corruption and, other things that were happening. There was also a sense that Pope Benedict hadn't really managed to skillfully get a handle on all of the abuse scandals that were still running rampant in the church. And I think what happened at that time was that the conclave in 2013 was looking for a fresh start. It's interesting because even though Francis was not on many short lists, he had been the runner-up to Benedict in the previous conclave. At the time, he was Cardinal of Buenos Aires in Argentina. He would emerge as the first pope from the New World in the history of the Catholic Church. He was also the first Jesuit. And, this is an order that has always put humility and poverty and their vow of poverty first before anything else. And that brought a different tone to the office. I mean, Francis did not wear the showy red slippers, of popes. He wore simple black shoes. He also decided not to live in the papal apartments, which are these vast quarters off of St. Peter's Square, and instead chose to live more humbly in a boarding house called Casa Santa Marta, which is located behind a gas station in Vatican City. It was interesting because when he was first selected, people were thinking that he might end up being a socialist conservative because he had opposed, for instance, in Argentina, the move there to legalize gay marriage. But what many people didn't know is that Pope Francis behind the scenes in Argentina had also been lobbying for Catholic bishops to endorse same-sex civil unions. And I think what you saw over the next 12 years was a pope who would gradually try to push the envelope when it came to inclusivity within the church. One of the first moments when we recognized that this pope would be a very different kind of pope was on a plane trip back from his first visit to Latin America in 2013, when on the papal plane on a flight back to Rome from Rio de Janeiro, he was asked by a Brazilian journalist about a ongoing scandal involving a cleric at the Vatican, a senior cleric at the Vatican who was allegedly gay. And the Pope kind of responded in a very interesting way. First of all, he used the colloquial word gay, which is something that previous popes have never done. But when asked in his answer, when he was responding about the idea of gay priests, and then later actually just about homosexuality in general, he was saying, if those people are looking for God, then who am I to judge them?
Se una persona è gay e cerca il Signore e ha buona volontà, ma chi sono io per giudicarla?
And that was a profound statement coming from a pope. And, in subsequent years, I would speak, for instance, with a lesbian in Italy who would tell me about how that one statement so deeply affected her relationship with her devout mother, and how after the Pope's statement, her mother had called her and said, if the Pope's not going to judge you, then how can I judge you, right? So I think in that sense, you could seriously argue that that change in tone did result for some Catholics in a change in substance.
I mean, he was certainly seen as, I guess, more progressive than his predecessors. You talked about kind of how he was pushing the envelope. How else was he trying to change the church to appeal to maybe a new generation of followers?
Sure. Pope Francis has both praised and criticized, for instance, on what he did with women in the church. He, shattered, let's say, the stained glass ceiling in Vatican City by allowing women to serve as heads of Vatican dicasteries, which are essentially the Vatican ministries, for the first time in the history of the church. But at the same time, this is the same Pope who kind of said not right now when it came to approving the idea of ordaining women as deacons. So I think this is why I think, some of his conservative critics don't always necessarily see the full Pope Francis, because in many ways, he also adhered to tradition. He was against, for instance, the idea of having married priests. So what he did change, he did more in a pastoral way than it was a doctrinal way.
He was also like a more modern pope, right? He embraced technology. He communicated in ways to people that maybe could reach new followers.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the Pope who used Twitter and social media in ways. Pope Benedict had a Twitter account, but Pope Francis was the one who really sort of used it and exercised it to its full power, let's say. This was also a Pope who was very much aware of the power of public relations initiatives, to get his message across. This was a Pope who additionally was, I guess, let's say the Lorax Pope, right? I mean, he really embraced green measures and, in fact, even went to summits with world leaders, where he would push the agenda that man-made climate change is a crime. And this is something that as Catholics and as Christians, the faith should be completely aware of and work towards solving. He also, for instance, very much embraced the idea of artificial intelligence, both its promise as well as its dangers and pitfalls. He did look towards modernity without fear. And I think he would also caution against falling into, I say, the pitfalls of modernity. But at the same time, he wasn't afraid to discuss it and understand that this is the direction the world was heading in one way or another.
And then what were some of the ways in which Pope Francis was maybe seen as less progressive and more traditional?
Well, I mean, for all of the, quote, I guess, liberal causes, you'd say, that Francis embraced, there are also others that I think you could point to where you could see really a more traditional Pope too. For instance, this is a Pope who called gender theory tantamount to nuclear weapons, right? This is a Pope who called for a universal ban on surrogacy. So again, I mean, the types of themes that he embraced were offshoots of his open door policy, of his pastoral outreach. It didn't necessarily mean that this Pope was saying all of these things are okay. What he was basically saying was de-emphasizing some points and emphasizing others. I mean, it's often said that what Pope Francis did was, sort of take the Catholic Church out of the bedrooms of Catholics, right? It wasn't so much about contraception or homosexuality or divorce as much as it was talking about the need for Christian outreach towards migrants, towards helping the poor. He would rail against religious hypocrisy. So, this is a Pope who was complex to pin down. I don't think that you can easily say that he was conservative or liberal.
After the break, what critics have said about Pope Francis and how the church might change now that he is gone. We'll be right back. Anthony, the church has faced some major challenges under Pope Francis. Can you talk about what some of those challenges are and how you think they'll maybe define his tenure and maybe what the defining crises were during his time leading the Catholic Church?
I think you could argue that this pope did perhaps more than any other, for instance, in terms of confronting the abuse scandals at the church. But I also think that there are plenty of critics out there who feel like he did not do enough. There was always a push, for instance, to have Francis embrace a more sort of zero tolerance approach towards the priests who commit these crimes and the bishops who hide them. And while he did take various steps at setting up, for instance, accountability offices within dioceses around the globe and things like that, there was always a sense that he never quite went far enough when it came to dealing with that scandal. And, even more recently, in recent years, during his papacy, new allegations have emerged in various countries, in the Philippines and Portugal, etc. So the reckoning is still happening within the faith. That will certainly be something that the next pope will have to deal with as well. As much as I think the Pope tries to stand apart from politics, he also did become a lightning rod, particularly in the United States. Ultra-conservative Catholics in the United States were not a fan of this Pope. Francis also weathered more questioning about his authority than perhaps any papacy in decades.
How so? How did they question his authority?
One of the biggest issues that they would often raise, it wasn't just the LGBTQ issue. There was also questions about, how Francis, his pastoral outreach, for instance, to divorced couples and things like that, was seen as going against church teaching by some of the ultra-conservatives. But I guess the biggest point would have been his outreach to LGBTQ Catholics. This is a pope who I personally witnessed dining with transgender women at an event at the Vatican. This is a pope who, welcomed them into the Vatican all under this idea of the open door and that nobody should be turned away by the church. The pope would argue that, he was not necessarily seeking to legitimize or bless who these people were when they committed their, quote, sins, unquote, right? But what he was saying is that the church should have an open door to everyone.
Anthony, when we kind of look at the ledger book of history and all the positive ways in which Pope Francis tried to refresh and update the church, but there's also ways that he fell short of that mission, do you think that overall he will be remembered as succeeding in transforming the church?
I think it depends on how you define transformation. I think certainly the church and its nature did change under Francis. I do think that his more inclusive approach and his focus on mercy and migrants and the poor was a message that really brought him closer to people who felt marginalized by the church. And not all of them necessarily walked through those doors, but those that maybe had been pondering doing so were given good reason to step over those thresholds. But you'd also have to say that his outreach created divisions, and those divisions are real. And those are divisions that now the church is going to have to deal with. We don't know who the next pope will be, but it's very likely that the church might choose to move towards someone who is a more moderate pope. Someone who would be considered perhaps not arch-conservative, but not arch-liberal, but someone who can build bridges between the two sides. We'll have to see if that's what will happen, but that's certainly one of the possibilities.
Let's talk then about the process for choosing that next pope. What are some of the factors you think could influence that decision?
Part of the factors, there will be many factors. Geography will be to some extent a factor. There is talk that the cardinals may not go back to the well of Latin America, which is, of course, where Francis came from Argentina. But that doesn't mean that they will not look towards, Asia or perhaps even Africa. There's more talks of perhaps going back to the well of Europe. There are some out-of-the-box cardinals that are considered papable. For instance, the cardinals who are currently based in Israel and the cardinal who's currently based in Morocco. These are an Italian and a Spanish cardinal that are based in regions outside of Europe. But a lot of the cardinals that are being discussed right now, there are some who are more in the line of Francis. For instance, Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines is one that would be very similar to Francis. And, he was on the tip of everybody's tongue a few years ago, a little less so today, but he's still considered a contender. But there are others, I think, that would be seen as sort of less progressive than Francis that are also not necessarily hardliners. So, it could fall to one of those as well.
And Anthony, for those who don't know, or maybe they didn't see the movie Conclave, can you briefly explain that process and kind of the rough timeline of when the next pope will be chosen?
Sure. So within 4 to 6 days of his death, we will have the papal funeral. Within 15 to 20 days after his death, we will have the conclave. The conclave is where all of the cardinals under 80 years old will gather in the Sistine Chapel for an incredibly secretive rite of selecting the next pope. You know, often it's been a choice that has happened recently within one day, but it's very possible that the next conclave could last more than one day. You know, first of all, it is the largest conclave in the history of the church. It's also the most diverse, with cardinals coming from parts of the world that have never had a representative at a conclave before. And I think when you bring all of this new thinking and this sort of fresh ideas into the conclave, you know, it has added this sense of mystery to the mix. That said, you know, as I said earlier, I mean, you know, a moderate is one strong possibility. You know, Francis will have named the vast majority of the cardinals that are going to select his successor. But the reality is, a lot of the cardinals that he's picked are not necessarily people who think exactly like he does when it comes to teaching and dialogue.
Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Anthony Faiola is the Rome bureau chief for The Post. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, check out our morning news briefing, The 7. We bring you the 7 stories you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Peter Bresnan. It was mixed by Ted Muldoon and edited by Lucy Perkins. Thanks also to Marisa Bellack. I'm Colby Ekowitz. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.